I never imagined that assisting a client would lead to one of the most intense and life-altering nights of my life. It all started a few weeks ago on what seemed like an ordinary Monday morning. I unlocked my office door, prepared for a day of counseling sessions, but the moment Michael walked in, the atmosphere shifted. There was an undeniable pull between us, one I couldn't quite place, but felt deeply. That morning, as I sat across from Michael in my office, the air felt heavier than usual, almost electric. Michael was a strikingly handsome man. His tailored suit and clean-shaven jawline radiated composure, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, told a different story. They carried the weight of something unspoken, something fragile yet urgent. "I feel like my world's been flipped upside down," he began, his voice rough around the edges. "And I don't know who I can trust anymore." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral even as my pulse quickened. His words were steeped in vulnerability, hinting at a deeper pain. "That's why you're here, Michael," I said gently, my voice calm and measured. "The fact that you reached out is a huge step forward. Let's start from there." He leaned back in the chair, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his words had physically exhausted him. "It's not just me," he muttered, his tone distant. "It's my wife. Something's off. I don't know what it is, but it's like she's hiding something from me." His confession hung in the air, charged with emotion. Infidelity cases weren't new to me, but this felt different. Maybe it was the rawness in his voice or the unguarded way he looked at me, as though I were his only lifeline. "Michael," I said, leaning forward slightly, "what makes you feel that way? Have you noticed specific changes in her behavior?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands, which fidgeted in his lap. "It's not just her behavior," he admitted after a pause. "It's little things. Moments that don't make sense. She's distant, secretive, and then there were the messages." The shift in his tone was sharp, and I felt a ripple of tension move through me. His suspicions weren't idle, they were rooted in something real, something painful. "What kind of messages?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and professional. Michael looked up, meeting my gaze, and I could see the vulnerability etched in his expression. "Messages she shouldn't be sending, to someone who isn't me." Later that afternoon, as I sat alone in my office reviewing notes, I found myself replaying our conversation. Michael's words lingered in my mind, as did the raw honesty in his voice. His wife, Lauren, was someone I'd heard about in passing, a polished, elegant woman with a social presence that seemed flawless on the surface. Yet, Michael painted a picture of someone distant, almost calculating. My thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of my phone on the desk. A message from Michael appeared. "Can we talk again? I need to clarify something." I hesitated before responding. Normally, I'd insist on formal scheduling to maintain professional boundaries, but there was something in his tone, even through text, that felt urgent. Against my better judgment, I typed back, "Where?" The reply came quickly, "Your office. Tonight." When he arrived that evening, the energy in the room felt different, tenser, charged with something unspoken. Michael looked more disheveled than he had that morning. His tie was loosened, and the sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled up. He began pacing almost immediately, his movements restless and his words tumbling out in frustration. "I keep telling myself I'm overthinking this," he said, running a hand through his hair, "but then I remember those messages. And the way she's been acting." "Michael," I said softly, standing to mirror his energy, "you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, the intensity in his eyes stopping me in my tracks. "Why are you so calm about this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Most people would tell me to stop obsessing or to book couples therapy, but you're actually listening." "That's my job," I replied, keeping my tone steady even as my heart beat faster. There was a pull to him, an undeniable magnetism that made it difficult to maintain my usual distance. Michael stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us. "I don't think anyone's ever listened to me like this," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. The air between us thickened. I reminded myself of the boundaries, the lines that must never be crossed. "That's what I'm here for," I managed, my voice steady even as my pulse quickened. For a moment, neither of us moved. His gaze locked onto mine, and something shifted in his expression, something vulnerable yet magnetic. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for making me feel like I'm not crazy." "You're not crazy," I replied, my voice just above a whisper. "You're just looking for clarity." The words lingered between us, and I realized too late how close we were standing. My instincts told me to step back, to reestablish the distance, but something in his gaze held me still. I thought the moment would pass quickly, but the tension between us was unmistakable. Little did I know that this was only the beginning. I could feel the warmth emanating from him, his steady breaths mirroring my own. His eyes locked onto mine, searching, almost as if waiting for unspoken permission. For a fleeting moment, I wondered what would happen if I granted it. But then he stepped back, breaking the moment. "I'm sorry," Nathan said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "It's not that," I replied, my voice gentler than I expected. "It's about what's best for you, for your situation." As I spoke those words, I didn't realize how much more complicated the evening was about to become. Nathan nodded, though the doubt in his expression was clear. I didn't know how to handle this," he admitted, running a hand through his dark hair. "Everything feels like it's falling apart, and you're the only thing that feels stable right now." His words tugged at something deep within me, stirring a sense of empathy that I tried desperately to rein in. I wanted to help, to ease the weight he carried, but I knew crossing the line wouldn't serve either of us. "You're stronger than you think, Nathan," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "You'll get through this." "I'll help you, but it has to stay professional." He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You're right," he murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't fully convinced. I don't want to lose this. Whatever this is." "You're not losing anything," I assured him, even as my own voice sounded hollow. "We'll figure it out together." The tension in the room didn't dissipate, lingering like a shadow in the air. The moment had passed, but its weight pressed on me, a vivid reminder of how close I had come to crossing a line I couldn't afford to blur. As Nathan left, his shoulders heavy with emotion, a pang of guilt coursed through me. I told myself I had done the right thing by maintaining our professional boundaries, but the stillness of my office felt different, charged, somehow, as though something fundamental had shifted between us. And I was right. Something had shifted. But I wasn't prepared for what would come next. The room felt heavy from the moment Nathan stepped inside later that week. The air itself seemed charged, as though waiting for something to happen. He didn't sit immediately, instead hovering near the chair, his hand gripping its back tightly as his eyes found mine. "You came back," I said, keeping my tone light, though my pulse quickened. "I wasn't sure if I should," he admitted, his voice low and thick with emotion. "But I couldn't stay away." His words lingered between us, daring me to respond. I forced a small smile. "I'm glad you did. We still have work to do." Nathan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Work," he repeated, the word tinged with sarcasm. "Is that what we're calling this?" I blinked, startled. "Nathan, I couldn't stop thinking about the other night," he interrupted, his voice raw and unfiltered. "The way you looked at me, the way everything felt so alive." I steadied my breath, my tone measured. "What you're feeling is normal. You're vulnerable, and I was here to listen. That's all it was." "Don't do that," he said sharply, his voice carrying a desperate edge. He moved around the chair, closing the space between us with deliberate intent. "Don't tell me this was just misplaced emotion." "It wasn't, and you know it." I stood, needing to move, to ground myself, but all it did was place us even closer. His presence loomed, both overwhelming and intoxicating. "Nathan," I said firmly, "you're my client. There are boundaries we can't cross." "What if I don't care about boundaries?" he countered, his voice quieter now, barely above a whisper. His hand twitched at his side, as though he were restraining himself. "What if this, whatever this is, feels more real than anything I've felt in years?" His words struck a chord in me, and I couldn't deny the sincerity in his gaze. The battle between logic and emotion waged inside me, and for the first time, I felt my carefully built walls begin to crack. "This isn't appropriate," I said, though my voice faltered, betraying the turmoil within me. Can't or won't, he asked, taking another step closer. His nearness sent heat radiating through me, a mix of fear and something else I couldn't admit. If you want me to leave, say the word. I'll walk out of here and never bring this up again. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, caught in the intensity of the moment. Nathan took my silence as permission. His hand lifted slowly, hovering above mine, as though waiting for a sign to continue. The hesitation in his movements made my breath hitch. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice raw and pleading. I knew I should have said something, should have broken the moment before it unraveled further. But instead, I found myself leaning in, drawn by the undeniable pull between us. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative yet electric, sending a jolt of sensation up my arm. "Nathan," I said softly, my voice trembling. He moved closer, his hand settling over mine, his touch grounding yet dangerously intimate. "I don't know what's happening here," he whispered, his tone unsteady. "But I don't want it to stop." My heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, drowning out the logic screaming at me to step back. His words hung in the air, and though I knew what I should do, I didn't. I couldn't. "This isn't fair," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "To you, to me." "Maybe not," he said, his thumb brushing lightly over my hand in a gesture so tender it stole my breath. "But when has life ever gone the way it's supposed to?" I searched his face, looking for clarity, for something that might make this easier. Instead, I saw only raw vulnerability, mixed with a longing that mirrored my own. "Nathan," I said again, his name a warning, a plea. "If we cross this line," I began, my voice faltering. "We don't have to," he interrupted, his voice steady yet thick with emotion. "Just don't push me away." His words were both an anchor and a storm, grounding me even as they threatened to pull me under. I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily, but the feel of his hand over mine and his presence so near made it impossible to collect myself. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just let this be real. Even if it's just for a moment." I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. The vulnerability I saw there was overwhelming, and I felt my defenses crumble completely. The moment was fragile, flawed, and fleeting, but it was ours. And though I thought it would end there, I was wrong. This was only the beginning. I could have spoken, but Nathan had already known the answer written in the tension that simmered between us. His lips brushed mine, not a kiss, not yet, just the faintest whisper of contact, enough to send an electric shiver down my spine. And then it happened. His mouth met mine, tentative at first, as though waiting for me to push him away. When I didn't, the kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, like he was committing every moment to memory. His hands found their way to my waist, his touch light but grounding, anchoring me in a moment that felt like the world had stopped spinning. The rest of the world faded into nothingness. There was only us, our breaths mingling, our hearts beating in unison. Nathan's hands slid up my back, his movements careful, restrained, as though he feared breaking whatever fragile connection we'd found. "Emilia," I whispered against his lips, my voice trembling with a mix of emotions I couldn't yet name. He pulled back slightly, his intense eyes searching mine, seeking something: permission, reassurance, or maybe even absolution. "Tell me if this is too much," he murmured, his voice a soft plea. I shook my head, my hands resting against his chest. His heartbeat thundered beneath my fingertips, echoing my own. "You're not wrong," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "But it's complicated." "It doesn't have to be," he replied, steady despite the storm behind his gaze. "Just let this be what it is." I wanted to argue, to remind him and myself of the lines we were crossing. But instead, I let the moment consume me. His lips found mine again, and this time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was deeper, more urgent, though still laced with a tenderness that unraveled me. His hand cupped my face as the other rested on my waist, drawing me closer. My hands instinctively found their way to his hair, my fingers tangling in the soft strands as I allowed myself to let go, to feel. The warmth of his touch and the intensity of his kiss were intoxicating, pulling me deeper into a connection I couldn't deny. We moved without thought, our bodies finding the couch. As he guided me down gently, he kept a respectful distance, leaving space that reminded me the choice was always mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," I breathed, my voice trembling but honest. His lips brushed mine once more before trailing to my jaw, then lower, finding the sensitive spot just below my ear. A shiver ran through me, and I arched instinctively, leaning into his touch. His hand traced my arm, up to my shoulder, and down again, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. The intensity built, each kiss deeper than the last, each moment removing another barrier. Yet even as we ventured further, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered of the boundaries we were crossing and the consequences we couldn't ignore. Eventually, Nathan pulled back, his breathing ragged, his dark eyes searching mine with an emotion I couldn't quite untangle. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing gently against my skin. "I'm sorry," he said softly, though the regret in his voice felt absent. "For what?" I asked, my own voice trembling. "For this," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "For wanting you in a way I know I shouldn't." I reached up, my fingers lightly pressing against his lips to silence him. "Don't apologize," I said firmly. "Not for this." He exhaled shakily, leaning his forehead against mine. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Neither do I confessed, my fingers brushing lightly over his. "But we'll figure it out." Those words hung between us, a fragile promise in the face of uncertainty. He leaned in again, and I let him, knowing there was no going back from this. Later, the room was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The weight of what had happened between us settled heavily in the silence. Nathan sat across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed as though in prayer. I sat curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow to my chest, my mind spinning. "This can't stay like this," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but raw emotion laced his words. "I know," I replied softly, though the words barely made it past my lips. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with an intensity that made my breath catch. "We have to decide," he said firmly. "No more gray areas. No more lingering. Either we walk away from this or we figure it out." The logical part of me knew he was right. We couldn't stay in this limbo, pretending what had happened between us hadn't changed everything. But the thought of walking away felt like an unbearable loss. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Walk away, I mean. But I don't know how to figure this out either. There are other people involved. Other lives." "Don't you think I know that?" he interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "I've thought about it every second. But pretending this didn't happen won't make it go away." He stood then, crossing the room until he knelt in front of me, his hands finding mine. His touch was warm, grounding me even as I felt like I was on the verge of breaking. "What if we're right?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "What if this is the thing that changes everything, the thing that finally makes sense?" Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "No, it's not," he agreed, his thumbs brushing over my knuckles. "But nothing worth having ever is." I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. He was right, nothing about this was simple. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me, waiting. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the emotion brimming in his gaze. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart. "I want you," I admitted, the words both terrifying and freeing. "But I don't know how to make it work." His lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "We don't have to fix everything right now," he said. "We just have to take the first step." The first step. It sounded so simple, yet it felt monumental. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw his trust in me, his belief that we could figure it out together. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "One step at a time." His smile widened, and for the first time that night, the weight on my chest lifted. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, and I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. We sat there in silence, our hands intertwined. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I felt like we were on it together. The night grew darker, and the clock ticked on. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, this moment was enough.